Welcome to my YouTube channel. History Vault. The Soviet-Afghan War, 1979-1989, was a brutal conflict that shaped modern Afghanistan, influenced global geopolitics, and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. It began as a Cold War-era intervention but quickly turned into a quagmire for the Soviets, drawing comparisons to the U.S. war in Vietnam. The war pitted the Soviet-backed Afghan government against the Mujahideen, a diverse group of resistance fighters supported by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. Over a decade of intense fighting left Afghanistan devastated, the Soviet Union weakened, and the world stage forever altered. Historical background. To understand the Soviet-Afghan War, we must first examine Afghanistan's political landscape in the decades leading up to the conflict. Afghanistan, a historically independent but fragile nation, was ruled by King Zahir Shah from 1933 until he was overthrown in 1973 by his cousin, Muhammad Daud Khan. Daud declared Afghanistan a republic and sought to modernize the country, but his policies alienated both conservative factions and leftist groups. Among the latter was the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan (PDPA), a communist party that had been growing in influence. In 1978, the PDPA staged the Saur Revolution, assassinating Daud and seizing power. The new government, led by Nur Muhammad Taraki, quickly aligned itself with the Soviet Union. However, the PDPA was deeply divided, and its radical reforms, including land redistribution and efforts to promote women's rights, angered many Afghans, particularly rural and religious communities. Infighting within the PDPA soon led to Taraki's assassination in 1979 by his former ally, Hafizullah Amin. Amin's rule was marked by brutality and instability, prompting Soviet leaders to fear that Afghanistan would spiral out of control. In December 1979, the Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev, launched Operation Storm 333, sending troops into Kabul to overthrow Amin. Soviet forces assassinated Amin and installed Babrak Karmal, a more loyal but weak communist leader. This marked the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. Soviet involvement and reasons for the war. The Soviet Union justified its intervention as a response to instability in Afghanistan and the need to support a fellow communist government. However, deeper strategic interests were at play. The Soviets feared that Afghanistan could fall under Western or Islamist influence, threatening their southern borders. They also wanted to maintain regional dominance and counter Western and Chinese influence in the area. From the Soviet perspective, the intervention was meant to be brief, aimed at stabilizing the PDPA government and preventing a full-blown rebellion. However, they severely underestimated the resistance they would face. The Mujahideen, consisting of various tribal, nationalist, and Islamist groups, fiercely opposed the Soviet-backed regime. Afghanistan's rugged terrain, deeply rooted tribal networks, and Islamic resistance ideology made it a hostile battlefield for the Soviets. The Mujahideen and foreign support. The Mujahideen fighters, though initially disorganized, soon became a formidable force against Soviet troops. Armed primarily with outdated weapons, they relied on guerrilla warfare, ambush tactics, and their knowledge of Afghanistan's mountainous terrain to counter the Soviet war machine. The United States, viewing the conflict through the lens of the Cold War, saw an opportunity to weaken its Soviet rival. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA, in collaboration with Pakistan's ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, funneled billions of dollars in aid and weapons to the Mujahideen. Among the most significant contributions were Stinger missiles, which allowed Mujahideen fighters to target Soviet helicopters and aircraft effectively. Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations also provided financial support, framing the war as a religious struggle. Thousands of foreign fighters, including a young Osama bin Laden, traveled to Afghanistan, further strengthening the Islamist resistance. Soviet military strategy and challenges. The Soviet military deployed over 100,000 troops at its peak, using heavy artillery, air power, and armored vehicles to suppress the Mujahideen. However, several factors made victory elusive. 1. Terrain and guerrilla warfare. Afghanistan's mountains and valleys provided natural fortifications for the Mujahideen, making it difficult for Soviet forces to establish control. The rebels used hit-and-run tactics, striking Soviet convoys and outposts before disappearing into the mountains. 2. Lack of local support. The Soviets and the Afghan Communist government struggled to win the hearts and minds of the population. Their policies were often seen as anti-Islamic and oppressive, leading many Afghans to support the Mujahideen instead. 3. War fatigue and morale issues. Many Soviet soldiers were poorly trained for counterinsurgency warfare. The harsh conditions, lack of clear objectives, and mounting casualties led to declining morale among Soviet troops. 4. International pressure. The war attracted widespread condemnation. The United Nations passed multiple resolutions calling for Soviet withdrawal, and the 1980 Olympic boycott by the US and other nations was a direct response to the invasion. Human cost and casualties. The war was devastating for Afghanistan. Over 1 million Afghan civilians died, many due to Soviet bombings, massacres, and landmines. Entire villages were wiped out, and more than 5 million Afghans became refugees, primarily fleeing to Pakistan and Iran. The Soviet military suffered approximately 15,000 deaths and over 50,000 wounded. The Mujahideen also lost tens of thousands of fighters, though exact numbers are difficult to determine. The widespread use of landmines created a lasting humanitarian crisis, with thousands of civilians, including children, maimed by unexploded ordnance even years after the war ended. Soviet withdrawal and aftermath. By the mid-1980s, it became clear that the Soviets were stuck in a costly, unwinnable war. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as Soviet leader in 1985 marked the beginning of a shift in policy. Facing economic struggles, internal political pressure, and international condemnation, Gorbachev initiated peace talks and sought an exit strategy. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed, outlining a Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The last Soviet troops left in February 1989, marking the end of a disastrous intervention. However, Afghanistan's troubles were far from over. The communist government in Kabul, led by Mohammad Najibullah, managed to hold on to power until 1992, when Mujahideen forces finally overthrew it. What followed was a brutal civil war, as Mujahideen factions turned against each other. This instability ultimately led to the rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s, setting the stage for further conflict and the eventual U.S. intervention after the 9/11 attacks. Legacy of the war. The Soviet-Afghan War had profound consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. For Afghanistan, the war left the country in ruins, with deep political, ethnic, and sectarian divisions that continue to impact its future. For the Soviet Union, the war drained resources and morale, contributing to growing discontent at home. Many historians see the war as one of the factors that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The conflict also emboldened Islamist militant movements, some of which later turned against the West, leading to the global war on terror in the early 2000s. The war's impact is still felt today. Afghanistan remains a country plagued by instability, and the lessons of Soviet intervention serve as a warning about the dangers of prolonged military engagements in foreign lands. The Soviet-Afghan War was more than just a battle between two ideologies. It was a defining moment in modern history that reshaped nations and influenced conflicts that continue to this day.